Good evening. Welcome. My name is Allison Byerly. I'm Provost and Professor of English at Middlebury College, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this second event of this year's Clifford Symposium. Since 1992, Middlebury College has presented an academic symposium in the fall term of each year. The purpose of the symposium is to focus the attention of the community on a topic that seems to exemplify one of the key elements of our liberal arts curriculum, making connections across disciplines, across areas, and across cultures. Our hope is that students, faculty, and others will leave the symposium with a broadened and deepened understanding of both liberal education in general and the particular subject matter of this year's symposium, and that these conversations will continue throughout the year. In 1993, the Board of Trustees named the symposium for Nicholas R. Clifford to honor him on the occasion of his retirement from the faculty. Nick Clifford, a man who exemplifies the concept of the teacher-scholar, was a member of the history department at Middlebury from 1966 through 1993. He played a key role in developing the field of Asian history and Asian studies more generally in the curriculum at Middlebury, and was instrumental in bringing our program in East Asian studies to a preeminent place among liberal arts colleges. During his years on the faculty, Nick was one of the true leaders of the community, a member of every major college committee and vice president for academic affairs on 3 separate occasions for a total of 9 years. After his retirement from the faculty, Nick served for 7 years as a member of the Middlebury College Board of Trustees and as co-chair of the college's bicentennial celebration. The topic of this year's Clifford Symposium, Islam and Politics in a Globalizing World, provides an opportunity for discussion of issues that are not only of great importance today, but will continue to affect the world that Middlebury students will enter for many years to come. We're very fortunate to have as our keynote speaker for this symposium a leading scholar in the debate on Islam and Islamic politics. James Piscatori is Fellow of Wadham College and of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, and member of the faculties of Social Studies and Oriental Studies, University of Oxford. He was formerly professor in the Department of International Politics at the University of Wales, associate professor at the Nitze School of Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University, and research fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. He's the author, among many numerous publications, of Islam in a World of Nation-States, co-author of Muslim Politics, and editor of Islam and the Political Process. He's an editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, and in 2004, he delivered the Eli Kaduri Memorial Lecture of the British Academy on Imagining Pan-Islam, Religious Activism, and Political Utopias. Professor Piscatori's most recent publication, Monarchies and Nations, Globalization and Identity in the Arab States of the Gulf, published in 2005, is an interdisciplinary approach to the issue of identity in the Arab Gulf states in the context of transnational flows of wealth and imagery, as well as the large migrant worker community. He will speak to us today on Iraq and the future of political Islam, and he's agreed to take questions afterwards. Please join me in welcoming James Piscatori to Middlebury.
Thank you, Provost, for those very kind words. I'm always very pleased when I'm not introduced as my friend John Esposito. This is someone who's been working in the field of Islam, but also has an Italian name, and we're constantly being mistaken. So I'm very grateful to you for an accurate as well as a generous introduction. Thank you very much. Half the audience is betting that I won't make it through this talk. They realize that our jet lag is settling in, I'm afraid. I'll try to stay awake, and I hope I'll be able to address questions of yours and comments at the end. I'd like to say before I start my talk that how touched I was by the comments of all the speakers in the first session this afternoon. I was very impressed by the sincerity of all those who spoke, and the eloquence with which they did it. And the simple elegance that was conveyed about Islam is something which is highly impressive, and very much, I think, is an impression that I hope all of you will keep with you. I'm sorry to say that in a sense I'll lower the tone by bringing us into the crass world of politics. It is a crass world, but I'm afraid it's an unavoidable one. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me say that 75 years ago, one of the greatest scholars of modern Islam asked the simple question, whither Islam? Where was the Islamic world going? It was a time of intense turmoil in both the Western and the Muslim worlds. The demise of imperialism, the crystallization of a new state system outside Europe, the creation and testing of the new neo-Wilsonian world order in the League of Nations, the emergence of European fascism. Sir Hamilton Gibb recognized that Muslim societies, unable to avoid such world trends, were also faced with the equally inescapable penetration of nationalism, secularism, and westernization. While he prudently warned against making predictions, which are hazards, as you know, for all of us who are dealing with Middle Eastern and Islamic politics, he felt sure of two things. The Islamic world would move between the ideal of solidarity and the realities of division, and the key to the future lay in leadership. Who speaks authoritatively for Islam? Well, today, Gibb's prognostications may well have renewed relevance as we face a deepening crisis over Iraq, the unfolding of an expansive and controversial war on terrorism, and the continuing Palestinian problem. There's certainly no lack of predictions when it comes to a politicized Islam or Islamism. Islamism is best understood as a sense that something has gone wrong with contemporary Muslim societies, and that the solution must lie in a range of political action. Often used interchangeably with fundamentalism, Islamism is better equated with political Islam. Now, several commentators have proclaimed its demise, and they have said that we are in the post-Islamist era. They argue that this has occurred because of the combined force of the repressive apparatus of the state is particularly repressive, and the ideological incoherence of the Islamists. That's one school of thought, but there is a contrary one, which points to a kind of Islamist proliferation in our age. This school of thought argues that because the state in the Middle East generally lacks legitimacy, and because the alternative strategy of Islamism is attractively uncomplicated, so it's the obverse of the assumptions of the first school, because of those, Islamist groups are growing in popularity and influence. Well, policymakers in the Western capitals have adopted the concerns of the second school of thought clearly, and as you know, have launched a far-flung war on terrorism. Indeed, the near universal view among policymakers, academics, and the media after the unsettling events of September 2001 was that rather than being out of the woods and self-congratulatory, we needed to recognize that we are facing a virulent and more dangerous form of Islamic radicalism than has hitherto been seen. Critics of President Bush and of then Prime Minister Blair were quick, I think too quick, to see hints of new crusades in their policy responses, or affirmations that they believed that a war between Islam and the West was inevitable. In fairness, it must be said that official thinking in Washington and London has been more nuanced than such starkly defined fears and criticisms would have it. And yet, ultimately the approach of the coalition's two main partners has been distorting. Iraq, of course, lies at the heart of views of political Islam today. The first attempt at linkage was, to put it mildly, clumsy. President Bush argued in October 2002, prior to the invasion of March 2003, that Iraq and al-Qaeda had had contacts, quote unquote, for a decade, and that Iraq had trained al-Qaeda members, quote, in bomb making and poisons and deadly gases. We now know that a part of the American intelligence community vigorously disagreed with these assertions, and they soon disappeared from official justifications for the war. More recently, the attempt to tie Iraq to Islamic radicalism has taken two interconnected forms. These are the assumptions which seem to underpin policy. Al-Qaeda is using Iraq as a base of operations and is stimulating sectarian violence there. Secondly, what happens in Iraq, as well as Afghanistan, will affect the course of political Islam throughout the world. Indeed, both the American and British administrations have predicted that the Iraqi war will lead to a reduction in Islamist violence throughout the world. Their main logic now appears to be that radicals would be lured to Iraq and defeated there, or at the least, that a defeat for the radicals in Iraq would deflate the cause of the radicals elsewhere. President Bush said in November 2005, if we are not fighting and destroying this enemy in Iraq, they would not be idle. They would be plotting and killing Americans across the world and within our own borders. By fighting these terrorists in Iraq, Americans in uniform are defeating a direct threat to the American people. More recently, he said, those who justify withdrawing our troops from Iraq by denying the threat of al-Qaeda in Iraq and its ties to Osama bin Laden ignore the clear consequences of such a retreat. The same folks that are bombing innocent people in Iraq were the same ones who attacked us in America on September 11th. Well, the two governments appear, however, to be out of tune with their own intelligence agencies. The official investigation of the London bombing of July 2005 reported that the heads of MI5 and MI6 had emphasized, quote, the growing scale of the Islamist terrorist threat. The National Intelligence Estimate of 2006, the most important annual American intelligence report, pointed to the war as a factor in the metastasizing, quote unquote, of global jihadism. The estimate of 2007, which just came out about a month and a half ago, reiterated this and concluded that al-Qaeda, quote, will continue to enhance its capabilities to attack the United States. An independent American study group, the Council on Global Terrorism, stated last year, quote, there is every sign that radicalization in the Muslim world is spreading rather than shrinking, unquote. Well, academic critics argue that in failing to pursue al-Qaeda after the fall of the Taliban, rather than invading Iraq, the United States allowed al-Qaeda to establish itself firmly in the lawless regions of Pakistan and in western Iraq. Al-Qaeda enhanced its popularity, moreover, in this view, not only among the ranks of Palestinians, distressed at the continuing stalemate of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and young Saudis or Egyptians, among others, disenchanted with their regimes that appear to them as corrupt and excessively pro-Western, but also among the disaffected young Muslims of Western Europe and perhaps America, torn in different directions. One thinks of the great Arab poet Adonis, who spoke of the kingdom of the bewildered rock and its central paradox. We die unless we create the gods. We die unless we murder the gods. An important part of the argument has to do with the encouragement of sectarianism in Iraq and elsewhere. Confessional animosity has existed throughout Islamic history. We must be clear on that. One 12th century anti-Shiite tract, for instance, was entitled The Devil's Deception. But today we are faced with horrifying pictures of not only Iraqis blowing up Westerners, but also of Sunnis fighting Shia. There is no doubt that al-Qaeda is responsible in significant part for such actions. The fetid anti-Shi'i diatribes of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq until he died, make this point abundantly clear. So too do the actions of his group. It has bombed Shi'i holy sites in Baghdad, Najaf, Karbala, and in February 2006 destroyed the Golden Mosque in Samarra. It proclaimed unrealistically the Islamic State of Iraq in the Sunni areas of Baghdad, Mosul, and Anbar province. So it's not surprising that some Shia have responded in kind. One scholar, Vali Nasser, has argued that sectarianism is now the defining characteristic of Islam. In his view, the tensions we see in Iraq have their analogues in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. With Iraq, the first Arab Shi'i state, a new Cold War may be unfolding in this view. One this time not between the radical Arab nationalists and the conservative pan-Islamists of the 1950s and 1960s, but this time between the Sunni Arabs and the Shi'i Arabs. Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia are meant to be the state representatives of the former, the Sunni world, Iraq and Lebanon, principally of the latter, Shi'i world. The initial reactions of the three Sunni states to Hezbollah's missile attacks on Israel in 2006 provide some support for this point of view. They all denounced Hezbollah for its quote-unquote adventurism and dragging the region into a dangerous war. Iran is clearly the peg on which regional order hangs. For the Sunni states, it is destabilizing. In their view, Iran encouraged the Lebanese crisis of last year, and as President Mubarak caustically remarked, the Arab Shia appear more loyal to Iran than to their own countries. With regard to Iraq, the border between Iran and southern Iraq scarcely exists. Virtually all Iraqi Shi'i leaders owe their positions of influence to Iranian assistance. Millions of Iranians have gone into Iraq as pilgrims, and the Revolutionary Guards operate with impunity on Iraqi soil. A nuclearized Iran would be even more alarming and dangerous. For the Shia, however, Iran provides an integrated and welcome support structure, a support structure of religious learning, financial aid, military training, and political protection. Sunni alarmists fear a Shi'i arc of crisis, what King Abdullah of Jordan has termed the Shi'i crescent, whereas Shi'i chauvinists hope for an expansive sectarian solidarity. The scenarios for the future may thus appear distinctly worrying. But at the risk of underplaying the difficulties, I'd suggest that we need to put the matter into a broader perspective. In brief form, three factors are important in this regard: differentiation, ideology, and transnationalism. With regard to the first factor, differentiation, and picking up a theme which has already been introduced this afternoon, but applying it in a more political context. Just as there is no Islamic monolith or Islamist monolith, there is no Sunni, or perhaps more importantly, Shi'i undifferentiated whole. Sunnism and Shi'ism constitute constructed and politicized categories, and much is made to fit into them. To take just the example of the Iraqi Shia, there are those who are loyal to Ayatollah Sistani and the religious educational complex known as the Hawza. Sadrists followers of Muqtada as-Sadr, are less compromising and intermittent supporters of the current Iraqi government. And while they are all anti-American in that sense, they have divided among themselves on the attitude towards Iran. There's the Islamic Dawah Party and the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, SCIRI. They work within the present regime, but they remain competitors with it. There are Shi'i nationalists who, however, have different views on whether the Iraqi state should be a unitary state or a federal state. There are Shi'i regionalists, some of whom promote the primacy of Basra over the central region, and others who call for regional separatism. Despite the comforting ideal of solidarity, then, the reality is of fragmentation and difference. Let me take the second point, ideology. This is not a very fashionable point to raise in political science circles. Nevertheless, I don't shy away from it. I think it has an importance in this argument. When talking of Islamism generally, it is the case, I believe, that we should not think of ideology as either rigid or uniform. President Bush, however, has referred to it as the ideology of radical Islam as, quote unquote, inalterable and totalitarian, and Prime Minister Blair has referred to it as fanatical. Ideas and beliefs are not monolithic or homogeneous. They are made up of a variety of strands of thought and multiple interpretations. Moreover, they change over time. Ideas, for example, concerning nationalism, popular participation and social justice, or for that matter, the nature of the state and jihad, all of these ideas are not stagnant. And speaking as someone outside the faith, it's clear to me that Quranic meanings are often ambiguous. Contrary to what may have been expected, for example, ideas of popular sovereignty now coexist with the concept of divine sovereignty in the political thought of Muslims in modern-day Iran. In the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan, Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Islamic movements of Morocco and Algeria, and others, we find flexibility of ideology. There is, in fact, a mixture of evolving viewpoints that does not fit the stereotype of the unbending believer, the true believer. In the case of the Iraqi Shia, as I've said, all factions have been dependent on Iran in some way. This does not, however, mean that they are all followers of Iranian ideology. Grand Ayatollah Sistani does not accept the Khomeiniist interpretation of governance, and his circle espouses a less direct intervention in politics than other Shi'i leaders who are more sympathetic to the views emerging from the spiritual city of Qum in Iran. In addition, each of them has had to come to terms with issues that lack established traditions on which they could automatically rely for guidance. There isn't a storehouse out there of received wisdom on such issues as what do you do about elections? How do you organize a multi-ethnic state? What is your position on the occupying forces during a civil war? On none of these is there a presumed automatic response or interpretation. And on all of these, they have had to come to terms with their own set of ideas. Regardless of whether ideology evolves in these circumstances, and I think it does, we should also recognize that it is but one factor at work. A simple point, I hope it's not too simple, is often overlooked. The various Islamist actors, leaders with established followers and organized groups, are political actors above all, seeking power and influence. This dynamic may explain why there has been conflict, or conversely, why there has been bargaining among Islamic groups at time in Iraq. But what is clear is that political actors are not necessarily preconditioned to a particular course of action. Let me take the third factor, transnationalism. Another general assumption about political Islam today is that it takes the form of widespread connections and networks, especially the more radical groups committed to terrorism. We know that borders in a globalized world are increasingly notional, and Islamist groups and ideas reach across the internal frontiers of the Muslim world, and they have an impact, sometimes tragically, as we know, even in the non-traditionally non-Muslim world, in New York and Washington, Madrid and London. We sometimes now speak of al-Qaeda as if it constitutes the central headquarters of political Islam, not just the core of Islamist terrorism. I want to quote a little bit at length these words from Tony Blair, because I think they're very revealing. Tony Blair, writing in Foreign Affairs, was explicit about the interconnection. Quote, "The struggle against terrorism in Madrid or London or Paris is the same as the struggle against the terrorist acts of Hezbollah in Lebanon or Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories or rejectionist groups in Iraq. The murder of the innocent in Beslan in Chechnya is part of the same ideology that takes innocent lives in Libya, Saudi Arabia, or Yemen. And when Iran gives support to such terrorism, it becomes part of the same battle with the same ideology at its heart." Well, however, to my mind, the specific circumstances of movements need to be taken into account. Nowhere is this better seen than in the cases of Hamas and Hezbollah. Let me just mention one because of the need to be brief. Hamas is pursuing an Islamist agenda, there is no doubt about it, but it is naturally affected by the particular circumstances of Israeli occupation, economic boycott, competition with the secular Palestine Liberation Organization, and the corruption of local elites. For all the talk of religious concepts in its basic covenant, one cannot make sense of Hamas unless it is seen above all as part of the Palestinian national struggle. So again, look at the circumstances of the group. And there is no doubt that both Sunnis and Shia in Iraq are connected to outside groups. But the extent to which a global Shiism exists is debatable to my mind. Despite the supposed commonalities, Shi'i groups differ according to national or local circumstances. Hezbollah in Lebanon and Dawa and Skiri in Iraq may have more common interests with other groups in Lebanon and Iraq, respectively, than with each other. And added to this is the suspicion in some Shi'i quarters that Iranian Shi'ism may be little more than a projection of Iranian state power. Why, the reasoning goes here, should we defer to a supposed Shi'i Vatican when it is really only a modern projection of Persian hegemony? Moreover, emerging anthropological studies are documenting a kind of localization of ritual, whereby significant differences in the observance of Muharram, a central commemoration of the Shi'i calendar, these differences are developing in southern Lebanon, southern Iraq, and Iran. So rather than pan-Shiism, then, we may be witnessing the development of nationalized or localized Shi'isms. Well, it would be rash, I think, by way of conclusion, to make predictions. As Churchill is reputed to have said, it is much better to prophesy after the event has taken place. But having foolishly put the future of political Islam in the title to this talk, let me offer a few general and I believe fairly safe observations. First, the Iraqi crisis, in continuing to pose a profound challenge to regional stability, will empower subnational groups of all kinds, including Islamist ones. The unity of Iraq has been declining since the 1990s in the wake of the first Gulf War and is now largely fictional. The occupiers, intent on regime change but mired in nation building, appear to have no idea of how either to remedy the situation or how to exit. In this environment, the immediate prospects for democratization, the assumed corollary of invasion, are dim. With neither the restraining iron fist of Saddam nor ordered give-and-take bargaining, the proliferation of Islamic groups of various kinds enhances the possibilities of radicalization. In a market metaphor, the price is bid upwards. Secondly, one of the two winners, if winning is the appropriate word, will of course be Iran. The other is Israel. Iran has aspirations that are both regionally assertive and, given the perception that it is encircled by the United States and its allies, defensive. It has close, prominent links with such non-state actors as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Shi'i parties of Iraq. It has the economic and military power to influence events well beyond its borders, and both the political will and the ideological rationale to do so. At the core of its greater geopolitical importance today is an Iranian-Syrian axis. This means that no solution to the present Iraqi conflict, to my mind, can be reached without engagement, above all, with Iran, but also with its allies, Syria, and the local actors, the so-called insurgents. Third, however alarming the prior 2 points may seem, predictions about a great Sunni-Shi'i divide in the Middle East are almost certainly overstated. Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has recently offered a cogent view of what he calls the emergent new Middle East, in which, quote, tensions between Sunnis and Shiites will grow, causing problems in countries with divided societies such as Bahrain, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, unquote. There is no doubt, as I've tried to suggest, that sectarianism has become more pronounced. In fact, it's a distinctive feature of the modern landscape, that there is an accentuation of difference. The self and the cross-identification of Muslims as Salafis, as Shia, as Wahhabis, as Sufis, or any of these other terms that we repeatedly hear, all of these are manifest now and are growing in importance. Salafi tracts often denounce Shi'i practices as deviations in such emotive terms that the sense of the ummah, the community of the faith, seems to vanish into the ether at times. But in a sense, we've been here before. In the 1980s, when the Sunni-dominated Iraq and revolutionary Iran were locked in a mortal combat for 8 very bloody years, the fears of similar uprisings and instability were not realized by and large, and for 2 broad reasons. The entrenched power of states in the region, with their abilities both to repress and to co-opt, and intra-sectarian divisions. In addition, there's often an express political purpose to the downplaying of sectarianism. One would normally think of al-Qaeda as assertively Sunni in inspiration, and obversely the Iranian revolutionary state as assertively Shi'i. While this is certainly true, it is also the case that both have approved of struggles beyond their sectarian patch. Bin Laden and his lieutenant, Ayman al-Zawahiri, endorsed the jihad of Hezbollah and depicted in broadly Islamic terms as the defense against Zionist and imperialist aggression. In a similar manner, the Iranian establishment applauds the activities of Sunni Hamas and is, in fact, as we know, has become its largest financial backer since the election of January 2006. So at the risk of seeming complacency and putting it crassly, and here's my soundbite moment, politics will trump religion. Or perhaps, somewhat more precisely, state power will serve as a counterweight to religious politics. And as Sir Hamilton Gibb, whom I quoted at the outset, said, and as he predicted, no matter how attractive the broader idea of the unity of faith, it is checked by the reality of division and fragmentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I haven't fallen asleep yet, and you've been kind to listen to all this. If you permit me one final broader point. I have been speaking about the specific impact of the Iraqi war and the war on terrorism, and thus perhaps leaving the impression of a conflict-prone Islamic world. And some, as we have seen and as we know, regard Islamism as inevitably radical, militant, or jihadist, hostile to the West and our way of life. Others, among them most Muslims, I suspect, feel that they are being judged by Western standards, or at least by standards that the West does not apply to its own policies. However we look at it, the critical question looms. Can there be evolution of thought and practice among those Muslims who are expressly committed to changing the world through political action? One way of answering this is to assume that rigidity, or perhaps incoherence, renders Islamism incapable of real development. It is, in this view, therefore, destined to fail. Another possibility, however, is that the very ambiguity of Islamist thought allows for space for the flexible development of ideas and programs. If this view is taken, then far from being in decline, Islamism is capable of adaptation and growth. We have, to my mind, examples from Egypt to Palestine and Lebanon, from Morocco to Iran, of pluralist and participatory ideas emerging and multiple voices being heard. If not exactly democratic or singing from the same hymn sheet, these contribute to a hybrid political theory and an invigorated, more open debate within the community of faith. What is often overlooked is that Muslim societies are in uncertain transition, and Islamic ideas are capable of evolution as well as manipulation. Jihad, to be sure, but also wider, if not yet deeper, currents. In a reassuring way, or at least reassuring to me, the old-fashioned Orientalist Gibb got it right. Islamism is not on a trail of decline, and whilst it is very much rising, it need not be jihadist and can be pluralist. The quality of the internal debate, leadership within the Muslim community, in his terminology, will determine the future of political Islam. The struggle over who speaks for Islam is far from over, and it would be regrettable if we, outside the faith, decide that it is over or impose conditions that distort it. Thank you. Open to questions, comments, objections. Yes.
You spoke a lot about diversity and fermentation and pluralism within something that we tend to think as monolithic Islamism. But you haven't mentioned a single time the text which underlies all of those, Quran. My question is, are there different schools of interpreting Quran that would express the same plurality as you had in mind? and whether the discussion is about the literal and metaphorical interpretation of the text.
Thank you. A very good question. I preface it simply by saying this, that as an outsider to the faith, I don't have any hesitation in saying straightforwardly that it is, like all religious texts, unclear. It is, like all religious texts, ambiguous. It is open to interpretation. Interpretation, I would go further. I would say that the history of Islam is just simply the history of the interpretation of the Quran. And that has caused, and that has created the conditions or helped to sustain or support the conditions for great flourishing of arts and sciences, but it has also led to quite negative things, such as closing of intellectual inquiry or violence. Now, that's simply, to my mind, because of various interpretations of Scripture. And therefore, if you take my assumption as, in a sense, a given, then where are we? Again, I'm speaking as someone who is not from within the faith. So, to my mind, it doesn't bother me that we accept that it is a document open to such interpretation. But where does it leave us at the end? It seems to me it comes down to the kinds of interpretations. And if you push me further and say, well, where are we? I'd say this diversity is present, but it's also maddening. It's also confusing. There's a cacophony of voices. There are many voices. And there are many voices which are, in fact, disagreeing with each other. Now, to my mind, again, that is upsetting, that's distressing, but it may ultimately be the condition for great development and movement, that there's a kind of a freedom of discussion, that there is a democratization in fact, maybe not a normatively prescribed conversation, but one which is just simply unfolding throughout the Muslim world. And so you have ideas here and you have ideas there, and you have very vigorous debates going on here, which are contested and which are calling for the opposite of openness, etc. We had a discussion earlier about women's rights. I mean, there could not be a more central issue on which there is debate and disagreement. How do we come out on it? We can take the negative approach, which says that kind of open-ended conversation is bound to lead to dissonance and to a lack of agreement. Or we could actually take the view which is sustained by Islamic history and normatively validated by Islamic precepts. Over time, consensus emerges. Not everybody agrees. The details are fuzzy, but we have an agreement that there ought to be an exchange of views, that women have a valid place in society. And I think from the debate that we saw earlier this afternoon, I think it's absolutely clear that there are clear problems with when we're talking about the role of women in modern societies. But it's also the case that the vast majority of Muslims, even the conservative voices, are put on the defensive about the role of women and are coming to terms with, or trying to articulate what is the Islamic position on it. So, a long-winded way of saying it's all open to interpretation. I think at the end of the day, that openness of interpretation will lead to uncertainty, but that it could lead to a concretizing of opinion around certain ideas. It could be bad ideas too. So there's no guarantee in this process. None. Sir?
I believe that you said that the two main gainers from the Iraq War were Iran and Israel. Iran, I understand. Israel strikes me as very implausible. Could you explain that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, it was a throwaway line. I should have said, excuse me, what I really was implying was that not that Iran, I don't believe I said that Iran or Israel were dangers. What I said was that they would be winners in the scenarios that was unfolding. And what I meant by that was, given the instability of the region, that in the short term, one could argue that the difficulties in Iraq and the attention focused on Iran might support Israeli policy. I meant it as a short-term condition of regional instability. But I concede a larger point, which you may be hinting at, which is that if there were a nuclearized Iran, for example, this could not work to the advantage of Israel, etc. So the question often is then, what is an uncertain Iraq or a failing Iraq in the interest of Israel or not? And there, I think there are just various schools of thought. So my real point was having to do with regional instability.
Yeah, I was in Iran over the summer, and I had a wonderful time. It was a great country, a very hospitable place toward an American. I guess I'm just curious about your portrayal of Iran's support for Iraqi Shi'i groups. And I'm trying to understand the extent to which they have a very close relationship. That is, if they do have a very close relationship. My question is a very basic one, and that is, how do they communicate? What is the lingua franca, so to speak, of communication between Iranians who are, you say, operating in Iraq quite freely, and how are they interacting with Iraqis who speak a very different language and have similar religious views, but may have very different political aspirations?
I don't mean to fob it off to David, but it is David's field, and he could answer that in much greater detail than I could at some point. But certainly Arabic is used extensively.
So the Revolutionary Guard is communicating in Arabic?
Maybe not. No, maybe not everyone. No. I mean, I'm certainly not privy to these camps, so I've not listened to the conversations. But certainly Arabic would be used very extensively between them.
Can one really talk about the future of Islam today without admitting the fact? Can one really talk about the future of Islam today without taking into account the massive Western presence in the Islamic world and the continuing failure to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem? We now are talking about keeping the American army in Iraq till 2010, maybe. Some generals talk about 2013. Hillary Clinton has not particularly resisted this notion. So what we're really talking about is a long-term American presence under the pretext that we're somehow going to solve this crime we've committed there. And in the meantime, we're going to have a charade of a conference on Israel and Palestine, which will not probably solve very much. So the question then arises, how will the Islamists and the ordinary Muslims throughout the Middle East react to this when the original impetus to the Arab revolt in Egypt and elsewhere was the revulsion against Western secularism? So when my concern is that a discussion that centers primarily on the intra-Islamic conversation really needs to take into account the fact that we've conquered the Middle East.
I don't know if I agree with all of your analysis, but thank you for putting the spotlight back on the, as you say, in a sense, the external. And as you know, there's been a considerable amount of debate over the decades about what impact the West has had. And it is certainly the case that there is a well-rehearsed line of criticism of the Western penetration of Muslim societies for introducing ideas which are considered which are secular and seen as antithetical to religion, and introducing other factors which have been offensive, such as cultural, social ways. So that's true. I think there has been a great deal of that. But standing back from that, it's also the case that, we are isolating that as a variable in an analysis. But the real world situation is that it's all mixed up now. That it would be impossible to, in a sense, to disengage from that kind of Western penetration, in large part because of globalization, in large part because of the socialization and the education of the elites, etc. So what I'm saying is that even in spite of well-formulated critiques of Westernization, Westernization has occurred, in fact. And that has transformed them and their attitudes, even if there may be objections raised to it. So it becomes a very difficult matter to sort of isolate it. Now, that's one thing. But then to sort of add to that and say, but the West doesn't just equal the ideals of the French Revolution. It just doesn't equal broad ideas like democracy and nationalism and freedom, etc. It also means support for Israel. It also means this war. It also means Islamophobia in Western societies, which is reported and known about very clearly in Muslim societies. Then it comes down to, are those a problem? And will there be, as you ask, a solution given the continuation of those problems? I think the answer is with great difficulty, will there be such a solution? That they are problems, precisely what I've identified. And again, I'm simplifying for the sake of the discussion, and I suppose it's more complicated, but there's kind of an attractive symmetry to this point, that in the great debate about do they hate us because of who we are or what we do, the what we do bit seems more compelling to me. The who we are is just a jumble. I mean, what is our identity? You know, Lamartine complained that the French Revolution had jumbled up the categories by which we know ourselves. Well, if that happened in the French Revolution, can you imagine what it's doing to us now? What are the categories by which we define ourselves now? And the same thing with Muslims. Same thing. And not least because there are millions of Muslims who are here and who are never going away. This is their society, rightfully so. And if that's the case, then the dichotomization of the West and the others and the Islamic world breaks down. So the who we are bit is, I think, not the way to go. The what we do side of it is, to my mind, is more compelling. But I recognize that that doesn't drive simple policy solutions to it. If we clearly recognize that American policy is creating enemies in the Muslim world because of what is perceived to be as unchallenged support of Israel, does that mean that we should abandon Israel? Does that mean that we should suddenly declare our full and complete support for the Palestinians? I mean, I can't see that sort of a policy prescription coming from it. But I just want to emphasize the obvious, and several of us were having this discussion at lunch today, that despite the argument that it's more of who we are, and that's precisely what Tony Blair, how he put it, it is clear from poll after poll after poll that the young British Muslims who are opposed to the state and society have expressed that opposition because of British support for Israel, because of the war, etc., because of policies. So I don't offer a simple prescription as a result of that, but I think we need to recognize the doing bit.
Actually, my question goes back to the same reaction of West as well. If I interpret correctly, your idea was that we have to, anti-Islamist movements have to step back a little bit and listen to the cacophony in order for the harmony to come out somewhere.
Right.
And then, I think I agree with you, but the realistic problem that I feel exists there is can we prevent the places in which Islamic conservatism clashes with West, and when they happen, realistically, there is going to be a reaction from West. So if we have a solution for harmonizing that cacophony, it has to contain those reactions from the West, and we can't necessarily exclude them. So my question is that if we don't dry the root of fundamentalism, if we don't destroy it, can we ever reach that harmony that you are
Yeah. I think it's none of our business. That's a very simple answer to a very sophisticated question. Let me pick up your theme, and it's also a point that was sparked by something you said as well. Here I just lay my cards on the table. Thank God I retreat to the university and do not have to do policy, because I have absolutely no idea what I would do if I were in the Foreign Office or the State Department. I have absolutely no idea. I have the luxury, thank God, of being able to criticize without offering a constructive alternative. But let me emphasize that point by saying, I'm going to reword points that you both were suggesting. Do we have a duty to facilitate the process? Putting it differently, should we export democracy? The answer to my mind is no. Now, I understand the complications of that. I recently said this in Sydney, and I was taken up by Clive Kessler, who is connected to a woman in a civil society group, a women's group in Malaysia, who said quite, I thought, very affectingly, very emotionally, said to me, I understand what you're saying analytically, that it's none of our business to get involved in their societies. But what do you say to this woman who is stuck facing a conservative regime that basically doesn't want to help to advance the cause of women because it's afraid of hemming in the fundamentalists, etc., the Islamists? I know. I see the problem. I think it is a great problem, and I think that would our standing back is bound to cause problems. Equally so, our getting involved is going to create problems, has done in the past, and I think is more likely to be the scenario. It's the kiss of death. Our support for a particular group will immediately, in a sense, disenfranchise them to a very large extent. It may produce the counterproductive effect of further radicalizing rather than diffusing. It requires a nuance, a subtlety, a calibration that I don't think we have. And I'm not going to take a cheap shot. This is not because, which is universally believed in America, in Europe, that Americans lack any ability to know the world beyond Middlebury, beyond their shores. That is certainly the case in Europe as well. The ability to control events beyond our borders is just simply something that we have to have modesty about and humility about. So I don't think we can do it. Now, having said that, what do you do? And I think that requires a very careful vetting of a situation, a sort of talking to everyone, which may sound blindingly obvious, but in fact is not what occurs. Talk to everybody. Everybody. Sort of, talk is cheap. See what they have to say. Listen to what we have to say. It's to try to engage in that way. And hopefully in the longer run, it at least doesn't do the disservice of eliminating groups that we're hoping to support.
In reference to the future of Globalism, where do you see the role of a secular Turkey, Indonesia, Nigeria, all the other countries who have large Islamic populations, Muslim populations, but are not in the Middle East? You spoke a lot about the Middle East.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering about the other countries, and there are a lot of them. There are huge populations.
Sure.
Outside of them.
Yeah. very good point. And one could add Indonesia, one could add the Muslims of Europe, the Muslims of America, etc. No, absolutely. There are those who argue, for example, there's Al Steppen, who's political scientist at Yale, who argues that at Columbia now was at Yale, argues that the debate over whether Islam and democracy are compatible is a ridiculous debate because it's been settled. The vast majority of Muslims live in democracies. And by that he means India, Bangladesh, Turkey, Indonesia, add them up, Europe, etc., etc. So, it depends on how you're looking at this. Surely what's going on in these other societies is fascinating. I would still say, I don't back off from my point about Muslim societies are in uncertain transition. These are too. For all the I think, arrogance of, say, the Malaysian regime in promoting itself as the spokesperson for Islam, there have been all kinds of one step forward, two steps back, and retrenchments and attempts to redefine their position. But there are problems there as well as problems throughout all the rest of these societies. But they're participating in it as well. And Turkey, of course, is a fascinating example because of the working against the received wisdom of secularism. And we're seeing that there are those who are attempting to argue for a pluralist and participatory Islam have to do so from that position that they are arguing against the received wisdom of the state, as it were, the received position, and in a sense have to come to terms with it. So yeah, each of these societies is working it out, but they're all contributing to it.
One thing that I didn't hear was one element, and that is the anti-Islamic groups and anti-Islamic ideologies inside the Islamic countries that I think are of a great number, or I can't say a great power, but a great number or great influence. Where do you think these groups would stand in the place, in the process of making decision, of acting with the Islamic countries? Are they going to converge to the West because of the ideological issues, or are they going to take their stand or converge or get closer to them?
Who do you mean?
For example, I can give you an example of Iran, which would be like a past example of Iran about 20 years ago, which was the communist ideas, communists in Iran. Or right now, for example, in Iran, a group that is kind of struggling, which is semi-religious, Mujahideen, that has their own effect, their own places in Iraq.
Sure.
Where do you think they stand?
I don't know. They've lost, certainly if you're talking about the Communist Party, they've just lost the wave. And they're obviously not going to be very powerful as a group. Nevertheless, the ideas are there; they're out there. I'm sure they're being reacted to. So I don't know. I don't know if these groups have such power. I mean, a better example might be the generals in Turkey. If you accept that the generals in Turkey are wedded to a kind of Kemalism, which doesn't accept a valid place for Islam. But in fact, that's not even true. Almost every generalization you can make is just not true. And so this idea that there's this popular voice of Islam which is rising and is being throttled by a Kemalist secularized military is not entirely true. It's not true. We know that the generals have been promoting a kind of a synthesis idea, that Islam has a place in the new Turkey, etc. So, it's like, the goalposts have shifted. We are no longer talking about the same terrain. Everything has moved. Everything has moved. And the idea that Islam has something to say, and something damn important to say, about public order, this idea is unquestionable now. And whether you like it or you don't like it, whether you can define whether that equals democracy or it equals authoritarianism, whether you think that it leads to violence or that it is inherently peaceful, that's just the position you stake out. But everything, in a way, has shifted. And, I mean, I hope, I don't want to, degenerate into a sort of a reaffirmation of postmodernism, but at the end of the day, everything is hybrid. At the end of the day, there is this sort of mixture of identities. And so even if there are those who are articulating this opposition to Islamic or Islamist ideas, they're just one part of the reformulation of this politics of identity.
I want to go back to the Palestinian-Israeli issues, and I would like to hear your opinion. Why do you think that Hamas won the election? Do you think it was mostly because of their religious ideology and their influence on the Palestinians, or do you think it was more because of their economical influence they have, like the community service that they do for the Palestinians, all these things?
Yeah.
And if we are going to do like re-election in Palestine, do you think at this point Hamas is going to win again, or do you think Fatah? And did the West see it coming? Did the West saw that Hamas was going into power or not?
No, neither did the PLO. I mean, in simple terms, and not to be facetious, Hamas didn't so much win as the other guys lost. And I think this is part of it. Let me reaffirm that I do think that ideology has an importance. It has an importance, the ideology of Hamas, which is an alternative national constitution. It's nothing less than that. If you take the PLO charter and you put that against the covenant of Hamas, you have two constitutions. Take your choice. Now, I think that different of interpretation, that different constitutional order, which was being presented by Hamas, provided for the cohesion of Hamas as a group to a large extent. And it probably provided for a certain amount of the mobilization of its followers. Did it win them the election? No. What lost them the election were the series of frustrations. And here, I mean, we just have to retreat in a kind of political science analysis to look to structural factors rather than ideological ones as the determining variable here. What were those structural factors? An endless frustration of the Palestinian people at a process which was going nowhere fast. The endemic corruption of the elites, which was clear to all. The ability of Hamas to be responsive to social needs at a time when people were thinking of the PLO fat cats as not doing that. These factors sort of come together, and what you have sort of a vote against rather than a vote for, which of course is the great problem, and here's the huge question mark over the future of Hamas. And by the way, this is a perfect example of the academic debate about Islamist movements. I made a big deal about ideology, and I want to reiterate that I think it's important, but I also want to put it into context. One academic argument is that Islamist movements are so hidebound, so wedded to this alternative vision that they can't adapt to circumstances. That it provides the reason why they were successful because it held them together, while the other guys were falling apart and all they could think about was lining their pockets. These guys were thinking about doing God's work, whatever that meant, but at least they were saying something different and saying it clearly, loudly, and effectively. That was fine. But what do you do when the situation is that for whatever reason, they then translate from opposition to power and thereby have to face all the demands of those who govern, which, in a short word, is compromise. Endlessly compromise. Give in. Most governments give in. Most governments will bargain with various social groups. it will be, giving in is putting it too negatively, it's putting it too simply. But by and large, the state in the modern age is one actor among many. And the state will have to negotiate with other groups in these societies. And in so doing, the academic, this is the counter-academic argument, it then starts to change as well. So you have two views. You have a group which says, one view, school of thought that says it'll never change because the ideology keeps it rigid. The other school of thought says, hey, they're practical. They're going to have to hold on in some way, and to do so, they've got to give and take and bargain, etc. So it remains to be seen. There are tantalizing hints, and that things are changing. We know that no group is monolithic, so that there are divisions within Hamas as well, some who want to compromise more, some who don't, etc. Divisions between Gaza and the West Bank, as we know, etc. You know, as a movement, it just has this sort of unity from the distance, but if we were to look at it closely, we would see all these difficulties. So at the end of the day, I think it was able to propel itself because it was riding waves of discontent, and it had a certain cohesion which the others lacked. Once in power, we just have to see. We have to see where it's going. And here, I think, you know, I'm an agnostic. I cannot say with any certainty, these guys are going to be Democrats tomorrow. They're going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, thank God I'm a Democrat and Islam supports democracy. I doubt that. I doubt it. But it's possible through the practicalities of governing, through the necessities of having to, in a sense, stay in power, that the kinds of tactical decisions will be made that might over time add up to a strategic change, meaning a normative commitment to that something else is needed than just a monofactorial state, an Islamic state. This needs to be, it has to be worked out, in other words, but there's no guarantee.
My question is in relation with the Cold War and the vanishing sense of the Ummah. What is the construct that is going to replace the vanishing sense of the Ummah?
Wow. This is a very interesting assumption you make, the vanishing Ummah. In a sense, I can see why you derive that from what I say, because I've made such a big deal about fragmentation and division. And I think that is true. I don't think the Ummah is disappearing as an ideal, as an aspiration. In fact, and again, this is not so unique. This is the debate over globalization put into the context of Muslim societies. As we now know, it's neither simply globalization nor simply localization. As we know, it's both. So too in the case of Islam. It's the Ummah and its division. It's the Ummah and its fragmentation. And I think to a very large extent, there is a concretizing of an ideal of the oneness of the faith, and that increasingly takes on a political cast, but it clearly does not override the fragmentation that we're talking about. So if you want, it's kind of a mythic thing, which is there, which everyone would agree ought to be in place. And in that way, it provides kind of a motive force. But you know, that's an academic answer. That's an academic answer. I don't know. I mean, I was so affected by the Muslim students who spoke earlier. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I'd be very interested to hear if I asked them a series of questions about the Ummah. I'd be surprised if I didn't hear a reaffirmation of an Ummah sense. So someone I thought very eloquently said, I am a Muslim first and a Bangladeshi second. That sentiment may not be what you tell your government. It may not be what you sign on the day you get your passport. It may not be what you say when you put your hand on your heart and look at the national flag. But it is a sentiment which everybody across the Muslim world would probably say if you ask them. Now, is that kind of a learned, socialized response? Yes, I'm a Muslim. I think it's more than that. I think there are layers here which you have to sort of peel back. If we could do that, and I think we would discover an attachment which is fairly deep. Here we are in the realm where we just can't make sense in a social science way. Do you call it deep structures, as anthropologists do? Do you call it implicit ideology? Do you call it the struggle for hearts and minds? What do you call it? I don't know. To me, it's just a stratum of identity which is there, and I think can't be talked away with academic theories. There's something there, and that attachment accounts to a large extent why people do care when they're sitting in Bradford. What do they care what's going on in Gaza? What do they care what's going on in Basra? But they do. And they increasingly say, not only do I care, but I damn my government because it doesn't care what's going on in Basra or Gaza. That's pretty powerful. Those are layers of opinion that we're only beginning to understand. So I think there's something there. And on the other hand, to think that that could be translated into the restoration of the caliphate, as the Islamic Liberation Party, the Hizb ut-Tahrir says, is of course silly. It could never occur in that sense. Nor could there necessarily be any assumption that the organization of the Islamic Conference, the major interstate organization, would suddenly come together and be an effective political bloc. None of that's going to happen. But it serves as a standard by which you may identify yourselves in part, and for us politically, a standard by which you judge and most often criticize your own governments for failing to live up to it. So it becomes a standard of legitimacy and delegitimization, and that's the political function of it, as well as these sort of deeper sentiments. Anas?
Just to pick up on this very last idea, the standard for legitimacy and to criticize your own government, I'd like to rewind the clock a little bit about 30 years when you had Arab nationalism as being something of an equivalent challenge to the existing state borders.
Yeah.
And that has now declined, and it is not nearly the same kind of route for critiquing and challenging your legitimacy. You had unionist experiments with Nasser in Syria. You had Libya trying various things, North Africa, for the sake of the Arab ummah rather than the Islamic ummah. And we know the Ba'athist parties and the history of Iraq and Syria along those lines. So the political scientist Malik Mufti has argued that this is the decline in that the use of those terms is due to the fact that as states became stronger, state national identification with the state unit became stronger. He actually argued that Iraq was a strong state from that point of view. So do you see something similar happening?
It's very possible. And as you know, thank you for that comment. As you know, it is worked to the advantage of, for example, Arab nationalism became Egyptian nationalism writ large. One could argue that of Saudi Arabia. One could argue that possibly of Iran. In other words, the manipulation of the force as a way of solidifying state power. So, so that it's the Ummah becomes a means by which Saudi Arabia becomes more important, because it says we're playing the Islamic game. We are the leaders of the Islamic world. We care, you don't. the pilgrimage, etc. So yes, that is a real possibility, and that again speaks to the whole theoretical information that we have about transnationalism, that at the end of the day it can be manipulated by states for the support of state structures rather than to undermine them. But if that's the case, to keep within the sort of that theoretical mode for a moment, we also have what's called constructivism. And as you know, the constructivist argument would suggest that alternative identities are built up. And while it is difficult to be precise about them, it has a tangibility to it, a reality to it, which may have an effect in the long run. So I don't know. I'm certainly not going to argue that the Ummah translates into a political construct of any great importance right now. But I think it's an element that plays a part in the politics of identity. Thank you. Have I exhausted you?